Hello and welcome to the Third Sector Podcast. My name's Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be exploring how two charities are using a theory of change to stay on track and promote accountability in their work. But first, we're joined by our senior news reporter, Emily Harle, who's been talking to Acevo's chief executive, Jane Ide, about pay and equality. Emily, what did Jane have to say?
So Acevo just released its annual Pay and Equalities report, which found that the gender pay gap among charity chief executives has nearly doubled in just a year, rising from 8.3% last year to 14.4% this year. To put that into hard numbers, the median salary among male chief executives was $67,000, compared with a median of about $57,300 for female leaders. Jane told me that this pay gap is largely due to a higher proportion of women leading smaller organisations, while men continue to dominate leadership in the larger charities. She said this has been an ongoing issue identified by Acevo's reports. So this year, 59% of female respondents to Acevo's survey were leading organisations with an annual income of under 1 million, compared with just 47% of male respondents. Meanwhile, 20% of male respondents were leading charities with more than 5 million in income, compared with just 11% of the female respondents. I asked Jane about why she thinks this is such a consistent issue across the years, and this is what she had to say.
It is extremely hard to break through into leadership, the most senior leadership level in a large charity. And that straight away brings with it a pay disparity. The pay disparity is frustrating and wrong, but it points towards the fact that there is something much more deeply systemic in this. I think what tends to happen is that women, and this is sweeping generalisation, obviously, but women find themselves in a position where either they are given the opportunity to lead because it's a smaller organisation, but once you've led at a small organisation level, there's a very familiar phrase that many of us will have heard of: you're a great candidate, but you don't have the experience of leading at scale. And that becomes like a concrete ceiling that you can't be seen to break through that.
Well, that's incredibly depressing. But thinking about charity chief executive pay more broadly beyond that career progression piece, what did the report have to say about that and the processes that surround it?
So, of course, the formal processes are necessary to be able to break through that, as Jane put it, that concrete ceiling. So it's really important to look at what the report tells us about that. It found that while more than 2/3 of charity chief execs overall had received a salary increase in their current role, a quarter hadn't received either a bonus or a pay rise. And the prevalence of salary reviews had remained static in comparison to last year. So 1/3 of respondents said they'd had no formal pay reviews over the past year, and that hasn't changed compared with last year. Jane thinks this problem is linked to nervousness around pay rises, which I'm sure we can all agree this is a prevailing issue within the sector. Your pay as a chief exec is most likely published on your annual accounts, so it's something that charity chief execs are very aware of. And Jane said that she believes trustees should do their part to make sure that these formal processes are in place to enable pay reviews for charity leaders.
Pretty much every charity chief exec or civil society chief executive I know, who, when they look at their budgets for the year, and we know they're going to be tight, they're always tight, and we're right in the middle of another period of time when more blows to those finances are coming thick and fast. When they look at that and they look at their own potential salary increase and what that will cost the organisation, they will sacrifice. They will sacrifice themselves. They will say, we can only afford that increase for the staff, I'm going to give it to them. Or we can't afford an increase at all, I'm definitely not having anything. That's one of the reasons why I get so frustrated that we see year on year on year that there is a lack of process, that there is a lack of a formal review, that there is a lack of understanding. And again, I have to take this back to chairs and boards of trustees. If we are going to be paying our leaders fairly, we have to take it out of their hands, because it shouldn't be a case of, well, I'll throw myself on my sword in order to make the books balance. And trustees, at the very least, should be challenging and questioning that.
Now, we know that Acevo has been doing this report for years, as many years as I can remember, and that's quite a few. But how does this one compare with previous years, and what can it tell us about the sector's progress on pay and equalities particularly?
So Jane told me that she often gets frustrated with this report year after year because it seems to tell the same story with very little change on the horizon. When it comes to diversity in the sector's leadership, Jane believes there's a wider problem of perception at play, and we discussed how we need to remember that hiring more diverse leaders shouldn't be something that we consider to be a bold move.
The problem is that the data is showing that it's pretty static, and you find yourself celebrating individual instances where an appointment has been made that is different. And I was almost going to use the phrase that is bold and brave, and of course I'm catching myself there because it shouldn't be bold or brave. It should just be, I hate to say this, and I say this with absolute respect and regard to some fantastic white male leaders that we have in our sector, but nobody considers it bold and brave to appoint a white man to lead a big charity, whereas it is still newsworthy in that respect if you appoint a woman or a black woman, almost unheard of. And so I think it is absolutely fundamentally not shifting, because it shouldn't be unusual. It shouldn't be something that catches the eye in that respect.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. And what did Jane have to say about how leaders can work to improve diversity and grow their own understanding of the topic?
We talked about the importance of continuing that conversation around diversity and using your privilege specifically to drive change and get the people in the room who may be experiencing barriers. So perhaps one of the most stark findings of the report is that the amount of charity chief execs from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds has remained the same for the past 4 years at just 7% of respondents. Jane told me that as a white leader in the sector with that sort of privilege, it's important to not allow the fear of saying the wrong thing stop you from pushing for improved diversity and advocating for others who face more barriers than yourself.
Particularly as a white leader committed to driving change, one of the barriers can be simply not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to do the wrong thing. And then you end up, as my mother would have put it, standing in treacle doing absolutely nothing. And so we needed to create that space where leaders could come together and say, do you know, I think I've got this wrong, or am I getting this wrong, or is this the right thing to do? And feel able to have those conversations with expert facilitators who can guide us through that and help us.
Well, thanks, Emily, for that snapshot into your chat with Jane. And if you're interested in learning more about the Acevo Pay and Equalities report, you can read Third Sector's recent news coverage on our website, and also keep an eye out for our upcoming written interview with Jane. Moving on to this week's main discussion. What makes charities effective? It's a big question, but one that is important for organisations to keep at the forefront when planning, delivering and evaluating their work. But how do you measure the effectiveness of your work and the impact it's having, and be able to adapt as necessary when quite often the changes you're pushing for won't be evidenced for many years to come? Now, a theory of change is one way to map out, articulate and measure a desired course of change. It's both a thinking process and a product, designed to inform the planning of your work as well as evaluate and learn from it.
We're joined for this discussion by representatives from 2 charities who are using theories of change to guide their work. First up is Helen Rafferty, Senior Programme Manager at Shine, an education charity that works with teachers and schools to help children in the north of England fulfil their potential. Hi, Helen, thanks for joining us.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Also joining us is Zahra Hedges, Chief Executive of Winning Scotland. Winning Scotland works with partners to engage with people who have an influence on young people to build their confidence and resilience. Hello, Zahra.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, you're looking at impact 5 or 6 years ahead in the projects that you're doing. You're working in the preventative space rather than direct service delivery, as some charities are. And you're also not working directly with the young people that you're seeking to empower. How is a theory of change helpful in this context?
A theory of change is really helpful for us, partly because we have so many ideas. And every time I was going to my board, they would be worried about our capacity because we're a very small team. And then I would say, it's okay, like this is it for the year. We're not going to come to you with anything new. And then the next board meeting would be like, oh, but we've had this idea. So actually having a theory of change was really helpful for us in terms of putting boundaries around what is it that we do best? What is the way that we can make a difference? And if it fits into that filter, fantastic. And if not, then it's about saying that's not for us, or it's not for us right now. So that was actually the driving impetus for us having a theory of change. It's also really helpful when we're talking to funders, when we're talking to potential partners, so that they can see why we're doing what we're doing. So there's lots of research that came out of Harvard University about the role of influential adults in impacting the outcomes of young people. And we've been able to feed that into the theory of change so that funders in particular can see that although they might not be able to attribute exactly my £1,000 did this thing, whether it's food parcels or clothes that have gone out the door in some other charities, they are able to see that without their contribution, that outcome couldn't be reached. So it's helpful for conversations. We're starting to use it now in our impact reporting and our annual reports. That's still an ongoing journey because we are right at the beginning. So we haven't got as many data points as we will have in 2 or 3 years' time. And it just helps us stay on track when the biggest challenge with prevention work is staying the course, when there's all sorts of winds buffeting you, and having a theory of change, coming back to it, revising it, checking in on it, helps you to stay the course. If we look, for example, at the Sure Start centres, there's been lots of research come out in the last few months about the amazing impact of Sure Start centres, but that was 16 years after the Sure Start centres were working with the kids when they were early years, and now those kids have just sat their GCSEs and done really well. Having the theory of change would have allowed them to keep going with that regardless of political machinations, and we're hoping it'll help us in that regard too.
And what's your attitude to data in all this then, Zahra? I mean, how do you kind of feed that in and how much do you use it?
We used to collect a lot of data and not use it. So actually our new theory of change, our measurement, evaluation and learning framework, we developed that with an organisation called the Charity Spark. And as I mentioned before, we're a very small team. So we were looking at how can we find out what information we have to collect, as in internally, what information is out there, and how can we use both of those things and the external evaluations that we get. So we work with universities and we work with external partners to help us evaluate our work. How can we decide what is the information that we need, and how can we build a framework that will allow us to create space for the unexpected things, not just measuring the things that you're expecting to happen. So actually we're collecting less than we were, but we're collecting it better. So we're collecting it at different times. So beginning, middle and end, but also after the end, so much further down the line. We're also collecting a range of different kinds of data. So some of it is what I call happy sheets, whether that's at the end of a webinar, someone will say, yes, I liked it. But then also much more qualitative data and focus groups, and looking at doing a deep dive into a particular school, if we're using the education field as an example, where you've got a focus group where we'll go into a school and we'll speak to not only the teacher who learned with us, but some of the stakeholders round about. That might be their head teacher, it might be some of the pupils, so that you've got a really broad range of data points that are quite shallow, but then you've also got some narrow stuff that dives deeper, but actually you're doing it in a much more routine way, and you're only collecting what you're actually going to use. So I'm quite optimistic that it'll be manageable and that it won't be seen as a chore by the team. It's seen as something that's exciting and something that's going to help them do their jobs better. The other side of the work that we do, which is around, it's a much, much bigger piece of work, and it's in communities. That's much harder with the data because we're dependent on third parties to help us collect it. And that is about creating a theory of change that has been co-produced so people can see why we're asking for the information, what they're going to get out of it, and then closing the loop. So once we've collected the information, letting those people who contributed see what it was, so that next time when you ask them, they know that it's been useful for something.
That's really interesting. And I'd like to go on a little bit later to talking about the accountability piece around all of this and how you're reporting back to people who are directly and indirectly involved in the programs that you're running. But Helen, if we could go to you now, what's your approach to a theory of change at Shine, and how specifically are you using it to make evaluation an ongoing process in all of your project work?
So at Shine, we support really brilliant, innovative teachers and schools to run projects that can remove educational barriers for children from areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. And I suppose, like Zahra, we are quite often working at a step removed from some of those issues. It could be that we're working upstream in terms of which year group we're working with. So perhaps we're working with children as they start secondary school or move from primary to secondary, knowing that those foundational skills are really important. But actually the results we want to see, maybe down the line at GCSE, they may be the real quantitative output of what we do may not come for several years later. Or we might be working in a field such as wellbeing or parental engagement, where we know the kind of factors that influence how well a child is able to achieve at school are very broad ranging and beyond academic, but trying to understand what our impact is on a child's experience at school from working in some of the kind of inputs around that can be more complicated than a simple kind of data point. And for us, we support all of our partners to develop a theory of change through initially a collaborative workshop right at the beginning of their kind of work with us. And for us, it gives us a way of really drawing out all of that professional insight, that expertise, some of those assumptions, some of those ideas that people have. What is it that you want to achieve with this? What is the output you want to have? And what are all the steps in between that mean that you think or know that this will be the right way to have that impact? The benefit for us is that it means right at the start of our working with many of the schools and teachers we work with, they can really have the chance to write down, develop, reflect on, haven't in some cases challenged some of those ideas, some of those assumptions. We work to think, why do we think this activity will lead to this outcome? Why do we think this outcome will lead to that impact further down the line? And then it gives us a kind of framework for evaluation after that, which is, okay, then I think really speaking to Zahra's point, if we're then either have quantitative data, is it telling us what we want to? Is it testing these assumptions? Is it checking whether these pieces are in place? Is it telling us that these connections really exist, that this input here really does lead to this outcome here? Or actually, I think many of our projects are quite early stage, they're quite small scale, and we are able to gather a huge amount of sort of qualitative data, experiences of children, families or teachers, like, as you say, focus groups. In some cases, things that some people would call quite anecdotal, but actually are quite important, really deep professional insights. Things I've heard people say are, I feel like the parents talk to me much more at the school gate than they used to before we ran this project. It also gives us loads of scope to kind of adapt, because, if any of those stepping stones, if any of those pieces of the jigsaw aren't working, then we know that the impact long term may be slightly more in doubt. And so really for us as well, it's a constant process of reflection and learning.
Thanks, Helen. And in terms of using the theory of change to report to funders, Zahra, is that something that you're able to do, and how do you go about that?
We are fortunate in that we can use it as we choose. So actually it's part of our funding applications. Often we'll look at how this pot of money helps us do what we think needs to be done. So then we can pick out at the end, at the reporting points, how we have done what we thought we would. A lot of our work is quite experimental. Often we are going to funders to say we think that doing that, based on what we've done so far and based on the academic research, we think that this might work. And it does mean that some funders don't want to touch it because they want to put money into something that they know will work. But we're fortunate that we've got a really good broad range of funders, and a lot of them are keen to change the status quo. So the theory of change is useful in so far as it helps us frame our funding applications. And then, yes, at the end, we can pick out the data points that will not only support what we do, but we are also quite good at saying, and here's something that actually contradicted what we thought. There's something that comes up that we're not expecting. We'll make sure to put that in. We haven't really gone down the path of doing much publicly with it yet, but that's, I think, because of the stage of the journey that we're at. But we hope that it'll help funders to see the value in preventative work when it is much harder. Like, it's much harder for us to say to a funder, if you give us X amount of money, then this will definitely happen in 5 years. Because even if we do everything in our theory of change, the overall outcome might not be as anticipated, because there's so many different component parts when you're talking about something 5 years down the line. I'm hoping it will allow funders to see what they're doing is tipping the scales in the balance that we want to go to, but it's a work in progress.
And is that the same for you, Helen, in terms of how you've been using it for funders?
I think many of the, challenges we have are similar. Sure, we've asked somebody to support some really important, really valuable early stage work. But we know in data terms, it might be either hard to pick that impact out of some of the background, or the impact might be seen later on when a child's 16 or at GCSE level. It can be difficult to make sense of lots of information and data for a funder and how it relates particularly to the work that they're funding. But I think the theory of change approach really helps us to articulate what our pathway is to impact, how we hope, again, all of those component parts will create impact. And it means when we do have lots of really exciting outputs or information or case studies to report to a funder, we can put it in context of a journey or of a series of kind of effects that will hopefully, we hope, will change things long term. I think it improves the sight of what it is that we're doing and why we're making the decisions we are and why the particular activities that we're focusing on are important. And I think it improves for us, it's improved the quality of kind of conversations with funders as well, because you're able to say, this is our plan, this is why we're doing what we're doing.
Zahra, did you want to add something?
Yes, we're doing a big piece of work with the Scottish Government just now, and we have found the theory of change quite useful in pointing out, and it's literally laid out like a path, step 1, step 2, step 3. And what we have found it quite useful for is to be able to demonstrate, and this is a big systems change piece of work, so there's lots and lots of moving parts. And the first bit, for example, one of the first steps is by listening to and collaborating with young people living in Scotland and their families. And then the second bit is and involving educators, project partners, wider community members, etc., etc. So even from those first 2 steps, it's really helpful when I'm speaking to colleagues in Scottish Government to say, this is what that looks like. When we talk about listening and collaborating with young people, this is how we can show to you that we are doing that bit. And then for the second bit, we said we would involve all those people. And obviously this was co-produced with the communities. These are who we think needs to be involved in order to make this successful. And these are the meetings that we've had. These are the agreements that we've signed. And the idea with the theory of change is it's very logical, a logic model, isn't it? So if you do A, then B, then C, then D, you are going to end up somewhere round about F. So by demonstrating at this early point, and this project we're doing with Scottish Government, it's a 10-year thing, in year 1 and 2, here's what we said we'd be doing. We're green on that one, we're amber on that one. Actually, this one round here, we're a bit red on. It's helpful to have an honest conversation and to actually give concrete examples of this is how we're doing it, this is how we're not doing it, and this is how we think we could improve it. And we've found for an organisation as big as the government, it gives them, because it's lots of different divisions we're working with, it gives a useful common language and a common framework, regardless of what lens they are looking at this particular approach with.
And what about other types of stakeholders, such as the people living in the communities that you are implementing your programs in? How are you ensuring or promoting accountability to them through this sort of framework?
It was one of the main reasons for us investing in the theory of change. So that community piece of work is called Planet Youth, and people can find out about it at planetyouth.scot. And I felt that the main accountability is to the communities, because essentially we're making a promise to these communities that if we follow these steps, then we should see young people drinking, smoking, taking drugs less than they are now. So it's a big ask, it's a big ambition. So the idea with the theory of change that was co-produced with these various communities, we have a national one, and the national one says, as I said just now, if we do A, B, C, D, then EFG will happen, and then we should end up at this place where we want to be, where Scotland is the best place to grow up in the world. But we also gave a copy of that theory of change to all the local partners. So we've got 24 very local communities who are involved in this, and they are grouped into 6 local authority areas. So they've all got their own version of this theory of change with blanks. So instead of saying and involving, and our national one is quite vague and it's all national organisations, Sport Scotland, Education Scotland, they have a blank space. So they can go in and write the Scout Troop, the Youth Club, the Federation of Small Businesses who are operating in their area. So the idea with having that blank template is it can be filled in by local people for who they think needs to be involved. And then that is published on a website, ideally for each of the Planet Youth areas. So anyone, a child, a teenager, a parent, a head teacher, can look at that and say, here's what we're supposed to be doing. Are we doing it or are we not doing it? And if we're not doing it, then they can hold it's tricky because Planet Youth is supposed to be locally owned. So who are they holding accountable? Well, they're holding themselves accountable, and they're holding the local authority leads or the health and social care partners accountable in a really collaborative way to say, we said that we would increase the protective factors around our young people based on the data. We said we'd look at the data and we'd see what's positive in young people's lives and we'd do more of that. I don't think we are. How can we do it better? What help do you need to be able to do it better? Something like this can't be seen as an us and them. It has to be collaborative, and that's where the theory of change should, in theory, come in. We're not quite there yet, but we are year 2 of a pilot programme, and we're seeing definitely more awareness about the theory of change and how it can be used, but we are operating in a context, and I'm not sure if it's the same in England, where we have systems, we have hierarchies, we have silos, and we have a lot of doing to communities rather than doing with communities. So this is part of a much bigger piece of work about when we genuinely talk about empowering communities, what does that look like, and what kind of power do I have to give up in order to give power to other people?
Really big questions there. And then going back to Shine and Helen, you're working with teachers and schools. Teachers are incredibly busy people. You've already talked about how this ongoing process of thinking through what you are doing and what you want as the end result and then being able to adapt as necessary is effective. But practically speaking, how do you develop a theory of change with the people who are delivering the programme with you, in your case mainly teachers, in the most time efficient way?
So, we do work with teachers across England, and you're sort of right, teachers are incredibly busy. They also are highly accountable in many ways. There's lots they have to report already. And for us, the things that were really important is that this process was genuinely valuable to our kind of project partners, that it genuinely helped them to think about and develop their work and wasn't really kind of adding to that burden of, reporting and data production and outputs that teachers in schools so often face already. The really key point for us is that if you set this process out very early, and for us it's usually within the first few weeks of working with a new school or a new teacher, it can help to guide, shape and develop the work from the outset. Really, lots of our projects are very early stage. They're really just an idea on paper, obviously an idea that's based in huge amounts of professional intuition and insight and knowledge, but we set out the process from very early on. We work with the University of Manchester to run collaborative workshops for teachers from very on in their work to get their theory of change down on paper. And then the next stage for us is, the simplest question to ask is, what is the most important thing here? If you could only measure 2 things at this stage, this term or this year, what 2 things would they be? What are the most important things in this? What are the kind of components of this theory of change that if you've got this right, the rest of it should hopefully fall out in the right direction. And if this doesn't work, then we need to go back and work out how to adapt. And we kind of ask our partners to tell us what that means to them rather than kind of imposing it from our side or saying what we want to know.
Now, as a parting question, since we are almost out of time, I'd be really interested to hear from you, Zahra, and you, Helen, if there are any charity professionals listening to this who are perhaps in the early stages of developing a theory of change or just bringing it into their evaluation processes, would you have any top line piece of advice on how they can make the process a smooth and beneficial one?
So we maybe cheated. We got help. We had the Charity Spark work with us, but in terms of investment of time, it was well worth it. There's obviously lots of organisations who support with this. It was great to have an outside perspective because of the kind of questions they asked us, because this is our baby, all of these, everything is important and we can do everything. And actually having someone focus and having someone help us actually do the consultations as well. So they spoke to our board members and we spoke to some of our stakeholders to feed that in to it. And then we were able to replicate that process when we were looking at another piece of work. So there's lots of blogs and things about it. But I think if you do have a bit of capacity money-wise to get someone to come in and start you off, that's quite helpful. And then the other thing is not to be scared of it, because it's not set in stone. You can do it, and then you can be like, well, actually this doesn't feel quite right after 6 months, and you can change it and you can tweak it if you want to. So I would say don't let perfect be the enemy of the good with these things. Just start where you are, use the data that you have. It can only help, really.
Helen, what would you add to that?
I'd agree that getting somebody to come and facilitate that process or guide that development is really helpful. For me, I think the important thing is having the right voices in the room as well. And that includes a real range of perspectives, but I think people who can offer the right opportunity to reflect or actually challenge, really, you can be very close to your work and you can be very close to your activities and you can be pretty comfortable with your impact, but having the right challenge in the room when you're developing the theory of change and having the right questions asked is hugely valuable and should lead actually to a lot of aha moments or real revelations if it works well. You can end up with something that you feel utterly kind of inspired and transformed by if you're willing to go through that process and ask the right questions and also have the right challenge as well as inputting what you already know.
Brilliant. Well, I think that is a great note to end it on. So Zahra, Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion about theories of change, and there will be more impact measurement related discussions to come on this podcast in the new year. Please do look out for them. For now, thank you to all of our guests. We'll be back next week to speak to Fozia Irfan from BBC Children in Need. Our producer is Nav Powell.